So who are you and what do you do?
My name is Henna Pryor. I am a keynote speaker and author of a new book called Good Awkward: How to Embrace the Embarrassing and Celebrate the Cringe to Become the Bravest You. And I am obsessed with removing the obstacles that stand in the way of people reaching their best and highest workplace performance.
It's great to see and hear you. Let's go back in time because we've managed to become friends over the past short while. I'm trying to remember off cuff who introduced us. Do we remember this?
I do remember. It was Leanne Davey.
Leanne Davey.
Mhm.
Yes. Okay. We got there.
Yes.
We both got there at the same time. You knew it. It took me a second. Our buddy Leanne Davey.
Yes.
It was amazing.
Wonderful, Leanne. Yes.
So let's talk about this topic. As you know, in preparing for you writing the book, we had a lot of conversations around awkward and what it means. Let's define it in terms of how you define it, only because I think we could actually set the table for a better conversation.
Absolutely. Merriam-Webster and all the dictionaries will give you 4 or 5 different definitions. But for the context of this conversation, awkwardness is a social emotion, an emotion of discomfort that we feel when the person we believe ourselves to be, our true selves, is for a moment at odds with the person other people see, the version they see on display. When there's a gap between those two selves, we experience the emotion of awkwardness.
Okay. So when I think of awkward, I might think of Elaine dancing on Seinfeld. We would have many instances of that. What's interesting about it is usually when it takes place, people don't see it necessarily as a negative. They might laugh and smirk instinctively, but then realize that's original, or I'm often like that. They will self-empathize to regulate your emotions. It's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah. So that's funny what you already kind of alluded to, this idea of when we see other people and then the self-regulation. So awkwardness exists on a pretty wide spectrum. Some people will use the term to describe themselves as, it's a trait. I am awkward. Gosh, I'm so socially awkward. And others will experience it the way you described, which is sort of a transient, fleeting emotion. Oh God, that girl dancing, that feels really awkward. Or that thing I just said in the meeting, that was really awkward. And we recover from it quickly. That spectrum, though, is wide. As much as, you and I might recover quickly, I've worked with equal amounts of people who will ruminate and spin on that awkward experience or interaction for days, for hours, for weeks on end. And so it's exploring that spectrum that becomes very interesting.
Okay, so let's not talk about the person who was acting awkward. Let's talk about the audience first.
Sure.
Because my theory would be that when I see that, whether it's Elaine or somebody professionally at work, the empathizing that I'm having is more of myself going through systematically all the times I've done that and realizing that the outcome of it was probably more embarrassing or scarring for me personally than it was for that person. And often I can't even remember who did that awkward thing or what that awkward thing was because I'm still ruminating on my own.
Right.
Is that part of the things? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it actually has a name in social science. It's referred to as vicarious embarrassment. So you observe someone else having an awkward conversation, doing an awkward dance move in the case of Elaine Bennis, or embarrassing themselves. And again, on a spectrum, some of us, we take that on and completely make it our own. And you already pointed to the idea of empathy playing a role in this. So those who are higher on a certain type of empathy, so there's a couple of psychologists refer to it as EEE. You're easily empathetically embarrassed. So depending on your level of EEE on a certain type of empathy, you can take on that embarrassment for other people. Now, in your case, you're able to watch something like that, think about your own experience, potentially sounds like cringe for a little bit, but then move on with your day. Others will take on an experience like that, remember how awful it felt to be in a similar situation. And for them, if they feel that extra acutely, it creates a situation where they will desperately avoid such situations in the future by pure virtue of watching someone else do it. It kicks up something in them that creates an avoidance. And that's where it becomes something that we need to address when it comes to our workplace action.
Something interesting has happened in society in terms of how we perceive these at grand public scales. I was thinking about the notion of even presidential candidates. Howard Dean and his infamous woo, and how that completely got rid of any chance he ever had for heading to the Oval Office. And if you transfer that against today, you have presidential candidates who will say things like, I could shoot a person in the middle of Main Street and that would only help me. And in fact, it fundamentally did when they said that.
Right.
Do you think that there's been this shift in how we are as a society? Because it seems like the things that we had done to get very public or public offices that normally would bear you, now it doesn't hinder anybody at all. It seems to almost be a superpower.
Yeah, 100%. So there's actually some interesting post-pandemic data that supports this. So there's an example I give in the book. I'll use a corporate example, and then I'll actually go specific with a politician example. In the book, I interviewed a leader, top leader at a telecom company, and she talked about the fact that her CEO was generally perceived by the company as this man that clearly wore a suit to bed, right? He doesn't smile. He doesn't laugh. He's very buttoned up, very stiff. And then, of course, in the pandemic, we all got thrown into virtual working. Nobody really had a chance to curate their Zoom background. And so all of a sudden, the CEO was running all hands meetings from the kitchen island. The kid was pulling on the sleeve and the dog was barking, and he's clearly flustered, going, oh God, I'm so sorry, everybody. I'm so sorry. And counterintuitively, his approval rating skyrocketed. All of a sudden, everyone was like, man, I thought this guy never smiled. And now I can see him sweating. He's pulling at his collar. They loved it, and they loved him for it. And so 100%, there has been a shift on sort of bringing our whole, blundery, imperfect humanity to the office. And in fact, I recently was interviewed for a recent article with Washington Post about Ron DeSantis. Now, feelings aside on Ron DeSantis, no matter what your stance is, the article was actually talking about Ron being an awkward American and the fact that his sort of inability to own it is an interesting play, because in some ways, when he is awkward, it actually makes him a bit more likable. It makes him more relatable, more human. But when people don't own it and instead try to be different, it actually can create the adverse effect. It can make you less likable. So there was a really interesting exploration as far as politicians about, is it a good thing? Well, it is if you embrace it. If you try to pretend differently, it actually has the opposite effect.
Now, maybe the pandemic scientifically did change it, but the stuff we're talking about happened way before the pandemic. I think about even leaders like a Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates. In my world, people would refer to this as the revenge of the nerds moment,
yes,
where perhaps in the earlier mid 80s, it was very nerdy and not socially likable. But then you have a cultural shift, whether it's Comic-Con or whether it's the fact that tech rules the world and Facebook becomes cool or whatever it might be. There is something intuitive now where we don't see awkward, at least I don't, as this grand negative thing. In fact, if you look at what is quote unquote even cool in the zeitgeist, a lot of it plays into this world of it being somewhat awkward and weird. We could look at even artists like David Bowie.
Yeah, I will yes and that statement. So yes, I agree. This began well before the pandemic. I think we started to see the backlash against overly curated Instagram feeds, right? We started to understand that we wanted to see people's whole humanity. That began before the pandemic. But the and bit is, I love that you brought up awkward archetypes of leaders. And I love also that you specifically brought up male awkward archetypes of leaders, because historically, especially in the business context, we see that archetype in successful male leaders. We see the Mark Zuckerberg, again, feelings aside, we see the Elon Musk, we see folks like that, even to the point of the creative, tattooed, visionary C-suite person. What we don't see, and this is part of the exploration of the book and something I'm very passionate about, is many examples in business of this successful female awkward leader. Typically, when we see successful leaders that own their awkwardness, you see them in Hollywood. You see Tina Fey, you see Mindy Kaling, you see Aubrey Plaza, but it is much less visible right now, the way we see the leaders show up to show this awkward edge, these bumpy edges, these less than perfect. And it's because women, and specifically women of color, are still disproportionately scrutinized, where their confidence needs to sort of translate to flawlessness. And so I'm very excited to see more names in that list be female as we start to embrace this new fully formed human in leadership?
Help me understand that. It's problematic because foundationally, those that aren't, let's call them male, pale, and stale, my favorite way to self-acknowledge myself, as you know, that maybe, is it because they are replicating it because they feel that is the path to it? Or that there is this fear of, if they are themselves, it will look other than what is a typical or prototypical positioning? Why is this? I'm trying to understand if they're mimicking or what is it?
Yeah. So awkwardness at its essence is a social emotion that comes from a desire for social belonging, right? We're communal creatures. We want social belonging. No matter which way we slice it, the norms and standards in the business world are still established by decades of male leadership. You know, what people look at as expected or normal is still set by a standard of male leaders. Now, every day that number for females in leadership, especially in executive leadership, is improving, but we're not there yet. And so to stand out, to have your bumpy edges on display requires sort of going against the grain of the norm set by the pale, stale, and male. And in that regard, we still have a bit of work to do before these awkward edges become appreciated instead of seen as a misstep.
It's one of those things that's infuriating to me.
Me too.
Because clearly you wrote the book on it now.
Yeah.
But it's infuriating to me because, as someone who came from the music business, and in particular working in alternative press for a long time, where you had a mass level of people from very diversified backgrounds. The weekly that I wrote for, the alternative weekly that I wrote for back in the day, had one of the first LGBTQ plus columns that was specific to. So when I think about why success often works, I'll go back to those original times in my life, and every single result of success was somebody who was original. And in that originality, there was massive components of awkward. And I would even argue that the leaders, and some of them were probably predominantly male, white men, no doubt, there was still a different approach that was taken by them.
Right.
In terms of nurturing or respecting or admiring or wanting to bring out those diverse voices, whether it was indigenous, whether it was African American, whether it was the early days of hip hop, whether it was the hybrid of that. So it's curious to me that we have this, but yet when we look at things that are quote unquote successful, there is so much awkward in it in relation to what we think is the map or the prototype.
Right. I love your comparison of music. I think about bands like, the Talking Heads, where if you look at the way he moves, but there's things that, they absolutely don't fit the formula, the four chords. And, to a degree, you use certain chords that are pleasant to the ears, and maybe you'll find some modicum of success. But the bands and the musicians that we talk about for decades to come, without sounding too cliche, they zagged when everyone else zigged. And whether you love them or hate them, one of my favorite quotes that I heard in the last couple of years was, "Love me, hate me, there's no money in the middle."
Yeah.
Love me, hate me, there's no money in the middle. You want to be remembered? You want to be, a standout? You want to make some waves in your industry? Or do you want to just do enough to be quote unquote successful and get by? The bumpy edges are going to have to show. It's not really an option if you want to make some sort of standout difference.
But that's the interesting thing. And walk me through, what is that balance between awkward, genius, and unique? I'll think about, we can stay in the artist realm, but we can move to corporate if we want. But I think about artists like Basquiat or Joni Mitchell, and not just the music and how different it sounds, but I'll definitely go down rabbit holes and watch interviews and conversations. And my reactions are always, these are such awkward personalities. They really are. Or even we can look at someone like a Mark Zuckerberg and the automaton robotic type of, I've met him and seen the visceral awkwardness of him, the leaders of Google, whoever it might be. And yet we are somewhat really attracted to that. It's like, what's going on? Even Steve Jobs. I mean, we could name all of them. There's this awkwardness to them, no doubt.
Yeah, there's two things that you said that I thought were really interesting. First, I'll say the most recent, the attractiveness of them. And that's not actually an accident. It's the lack of perfection actually puts us at ease. So, in psychology, it's the pratfall effect, which essentially is this idea that when we see someone who is ultra competent and very smart and capable, that lack of perfection knocks them off their proverbial pedestal a little bit and makes them more accessible, more likable. So literally you can be a, super smart CEO that we literally feel is untouchable, but then they drop a cup of coffee in their lap and all of a sudden you're like, oh, thank God. They do dumb stuff like me all the time too. It's refreshing in a way. The second thing I wanted to point to is you asked sort of the difference between, awkwardness and genius, or the creative types. And I think the distinction there is, in order for an experience or even a person to be deemed awkward, first of all, it's subjective. I think similar to the way the word genius is. It's up to others to deem them so, or up to ourselves to deem ourselves so. It's not something that factually can be assigned. But in the case of awkwardness specifically, what we need to factor in is a bit of uncertainty. So for awkwardness to be an emotion that joins the conversation, it implies that there is some uncertainty, whether it's unplanned uncertainty, I tripped over my own 2 feet on the way to collect an award at the Oscars, or, hey, I raised my hand to come up with this amazing idea that fell completely flat, silence in the room. That was a planned risk, but still the response was what was uncertain. In the case of Zuckerberg, when we call him awkward, what we're essentially saying in so many words is we expect him to look and sound a certain way, and yet he sounds and looks a different way. That's where that uncertainty kind of kicks up.
Yeah, I think the definition of him that might be more applicable is you're running a platform by which people are sharing an emotional and humorous and all these extreme emotions that you yourself look like you cannot express any emotion.
Right. We most often teach what we need to learn, right? So here he is creating the platform that allows him to not have to communicate in those ways and can be his best self behind a screen.
And let's be honest, if we dig into the individuals, myself, everyone, I dread my awkward moments. I could still look at them and remember them, knowing full well that those who experience them probably don't even think about them twice. But even with this information, even reading good awkward, there's no doubt that when I hear the word awkward, I immediately go to the 4 or 5 highlights in my highlight reel that were my, if I could just go out into the world and take my foot and grab it back and remove it from my mouth, what I wouldn't give for those moments.
Right. So I love the choice of words, the dread. Of course you do. It's a discomfort emotion. It is not, no one is claiming that awkwardness is something that feels good in the moment or that we look forward to in those moments. It is an emotion of discomfort. So yes, there is a sense of dread. And what you described about those people who, quote unquote, don't even feel it or they don't even experience it, that's actually part of the awareness building. Is they absolutely do. There is not one person, let's say, that has a normal brain wiring, not one person that gets to avoid the emotion of awkwardness. It's about their bounce back rate. It's about their recovery rate. So they feel it. They absolutely feel it. And perhaps just as acutely as you do, they just don't linger there. They don't ruminate on it for seconds, minutes, weeks. They recover very quickly and they're on to the next. Or they actually take it a step further and own it. You'll be very, surprised to learn that the most confident people are the most vocal about their awkwardness. They'll say something, foot in mouth, man, that was awkward, right? Or, oh, cringe, God, can you believe me, right? They own it right away. And in that moment, our perception of them is not, oh, what a socially awkward human. It's, oh, that person owns their stuff. They're very confident.
It's funny that as you're saying this, I'm reminded of, I've seen a million concerts. I go to concerts all the time, love music, you know that.
Mm-hmm.
And recently, I went to go see the band Toto, Africa, Rosanna, Hold the Line, all the hits. And Steve Lukather, well-known guitarist, not just for Toto, but a session musician, very well-versed, probably has been on stage and played with bands more than any living musician possibly in the world. And he fell on his butt. And it took him a bit to get back up. But what I acknowledged, being also somebody who gets up on stages and speaks a lot, is exactly what you said. He did not recover quickly. He was embarrassed. You could see he was embarrassed. He kept shaking his head back to the other members of the band, almost like, I can't believe that happened, or I'm fine. But he kept going and going. And I felt like we were watching this car accident happen over and over. And I don't think anybody else in the audience necessarily saw it the way I did. But I was really taken aback by how that must have happened tons of times in their career. he could not get over it. And I thought, we're already in the next song, we're moving forward. And he was still walking over to other members of the band and talking to them and talking about it and shaking, getting a bit flushed and embarrassed by it. I couldn't believe it. I
Yeah,
just
and
really thought you would have recovered so much faster.
you'd think with all that practice, and yet, I can only imagine as the concert goer, there was an impact on the experience. I think everybody in the audience probably had this little sense of, gosh, can we just move on? Because then you're still stuck in that experience with him, where every part of you wants to be like, it happened, let's own it, let's move on. And so it does have that effect on others too.
So the other side of this that is really interesting, I love thinking about culture and how we react to these things and how we can change perspectives on this. You know this because we talked about this even in the title, and the word awkward and what it means is we have a saying that's very real and growing, which is, it's so cringe. The kids will say it, we'll say it as individuals. So as much as we also acknowledge this change and love people like this, we have this new saying of how cringe everything is. Have you thought about why we carry these two things with us so deeply, or why it becomes a meme even unto itself?
Yeah, my daughter's 13. I know you've got teenagers too. And so this feels like something you say about everything, right? Everything is so cringe.
I'm always cringe. That's me. Yeah,
I was going to say, mother of a 13-year-old daughter, there's not one thing I do that's not cringe. To me, when people use that expression, essentially what they're saying is, in this moment, that doesn't feel socially palatable. It doesn't fit the norm of what feels like it's socially accepted. And ultimately, what that speaks to more than anything for me is twofold. Is, first, an examination of what do you deem socially palatable? For you, what might be cringe for another population of people might be their greatest day ever. Yeah. So that's an opinion, right? I try to remind my daughter of that. That's an opinion. The second thing is, ultimately, people bond over emotions of discomfort. So the same way, in an office, a workplace setting, when people are, going through some hard times or there's change afoot and they like to complain and vent to each other, when there is a situation that threatens to expose social bumpy edges, it is a bit of a bonding thing in community to go, oh God, cringe. Oh, do you see that? And the people in your circle that you're speaking to, if they agree with you, it creates that momentary bond. And so it kind of feels like a way to access some community just by virtue of having a shared belief about whatever that social thing is. Whether it's true or not, I think it's a little overused, but whatever helps people bond in this moment, I'm not going to fight it.
So what's the conclusion here? Are we trying to get people to have less moments that are awkward? Are we trying to have people understand those moments that are awkward and how to adapt and add them in and make them readily available? Are we saying that awkward is this superpower and we should try to amplify how many times we're being awkward? I believe that people have changed and people have different perspectives and feelings and self-regulating emotions. Ultimately, are we trying to unify this thing or make it diverse? What are we trying to do with this?
Yeah. Answer to question number one, are we trying to have fewer of those moments? No, that's impossible, because to eliminate awkwardness, to eliminate an awkward moment is to eliminate all of life's inherent uncertainty. So good luck with that, right? If you've cracked the code, Mitch, I'll take it, but I have yet to discover it.
I'm awash in them, Henna. You know that.
Yes. So that's not an option. Knowing option A is not on the table. Option B is twofold. It's A, bringing more awareness to the emotion so that when it arises, it does not have the iron grip on you, especially if you are someone for whom it does have an iron grip, understanding what it represents, what it means, and having the awareness to peel back the layers so that it doesn't have that grip on you. But second part, and perhaps more importantly, and where I see an opportunity, is today we live in a world that seems to continue to optimize for social smoothness. We are not made to have to interact with each other in social ways the way we used to. So, people are now dating by swiping. You're not going up to someone in the bar and asking for their number. We are increasingly and troublingly having tough conversations via Slack or DM instead of approaching someone on the phone or in person. And so where I see great opportunity as it relates to conditioning social muscle, or conditioning awkward tolerance, as I like to call it, is intentionality. How do we create more opportunities in the workplace for teams, for leaders and their direct reports to purposefully invite conversations before they are needed, before the unplanned moments, to build social awkward muscle? So this could be bad idea brainstorms at the beginning of a meeting. I like to use the term cracked egg stories. How do we share missteps and embarrassing moments and foot and mouth and blunders in real time, rather than only bringing them up when someone else has done it and saying, hey, oh yeah, I've been there too. How do we bring those conversations to the forefront? And there's actually a host of additional creativity and innovation benefits that come from having those conversations. But conditioning the muscle, to me, is our greatest opportunity going forward.
In a simplistic way, are we talking about building confidence?
Building social confidence, yes. I would say that there's, confidence can carry a variety of attributes, but there's, to me, confidence can be my inherent belief in my own capabilities and my self-worth. That can sometimes be an individual exercise. What I see slipping away, and frankly, even in my own kids, 13 and 11, is social confidence, the willingness to go up to someone else and share a compliment or share a, hey, you've got something in your teeth, without worrying about the social ramifications. I've seen a particular brand of confidence start to slide. And so when that starts to be addressed, there's an absolute ripple effect to all the other places that confidence can grow. Social confidence, especially, is becoming a little trickier in certain environments where friction is low.
So, what's the net result of that? You have better ideas and people who want to bring them whole selves to work. Do you then actually maybe create a more divisive environment because you might have people who are just introverted by nature and aren't going to get there? How do you balance for that personality, which is a huge thing that employers are looking at now?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up actually the introverted personality, because people often ask me, especially in the work for this book, is this about introverts? And I tell them, absolutely not. I am a through and through extrovert. There's not one part of me that would identify as an introvert. I get all my energy from being around other people. And what it speaks to is this experience that as humans, no matter introvert, extrovert, we all experience when we're in a social situation where uncertainty is guaranteed. So I'll just give a very concrete example. We all can relate to that moment following the pandemic where we had our first in-person gathering of, let's say, more than a few people. Okay. And we're like, what do I do with my hands? Are we hugging? Are we fist bumping? Are we air kissing? Like, do you want to stand a little further? Are you good with me standing here? Right. None of us knew what the hell was going on. And in the book, I share this example of, I met with a client for the first time and I gave this great, sales pitch. Henna is killing it. I'm killing it right now. 15 minutes of my finest sales pitching. And he raises his hand. I'm like, hell yeah, I crushed that. And I give him a high five. And he looks me square in the eye, goes, Henna, I was putting my hand up because I was trying to tell you to stop. And I was like, oh my God. And so it's this out of practice that we had in the few years of the pandemic. Again, not an introvert, and I'm an extrovert, but I was out of practice reading social cues, body signals, body language that created what for me in that moment was an incredibly awkward interaction. But it was because for a series of years, I was out of practice. So this is just one way that even the extroverted among us can see how conditioning the muscles, keeping those social muscles active, is extremely important. And so when it comes to introverts, yes, this is a little bit more of an energy expenditure. To practice this is for sure more of an energy expenditure, but I would argue even more critical in an era where, AI and technology is taking over some of the more manual tasks. I do believe our social strength is going to become a can't lose superpower in the years to come.
But the scaling of it culturally is also really interesting. I'm thinking about the fact that I'm Canadian versus American versus if you look at cultures, that Japanese culture versus a Finnish culture, the way they are as people, the way we are as people is so different. I can take this analogy that you're using of the pandemic and think about some of those initial times I was back in the US. We were still in lockdown. So even the idea of, forget like how politicized masking became and all of that, it was more like, I need to go back to a culture that is very different from this. And so the way I interact has to be fundamentally different. If you scale that to removing the pandemic and thinking just about how cultures are, how multinational organizations work, that it's very, very different. I mean, you are dealing with people, putting aside awkward, that just socially interact in such a different way. Have you thought about how that plays out?
Yeah, that's a great call out. And I think this is an important consideration. I think each culture, each company, each organization could stand to clearly identify their own social norms. So I'll give you an example. Certainly there are cultures where you coming up to me boldly and getting in my face about something. Not only is that awkward, that's disrespectful. It's uncomfortable, right? We're not trying to cross boundaries here of people's comfort level. But what I think we could stand to do, there's an exercise I run with teams often around creating social norms and even digital norms. So for example, if you've gone back and forth with a colleague more than 3 or 4 times on a Slack or on a Teams message, that's a cue that you need to take it to phone, right? You need to take it to conversation. But essentially, the team has upfront created some social norms. Now, this isn't about discomfort. This isn't about introversion versus extroversion. This is talking about, business success is once something has gone back and forth a number of times, while it may be uncomfortable to pick up the phone, while your preference as an introvert may be to keep that online, as a company, as a culture, we've decided there is value in making that conversation a phone conversation, a live conversation. And for some folks, again, that's more difficult than others. That's not trying to make people be someone they're not. It's deciding where do we see the business value in this activity and where can we make that part of the fabric of our culture.
I know that often when I have these conversations, Henna, I'm thinking to myself, I want to avoid talking about the pandemic or COVID-19 or anything related to it because it feels like it is somewhat in the distance. Although as we're recording this, a lot of people seem to have COVID for sure.
Yeah.
We've changed as a society, as a world, there's no doubt. But the reason I bring it up is because I feel like the one thing that really hasn't regulated is how we work and how we do things. There is no real answer to what work looks like today. And it is directly related to this. So I'm always cautious because I don't want to be talking about the pandemic and feel like I just can't get over it or it happened so recently. But I don't think the result of how we work has, quote unquote, settled itself yet. But I'm curious in relation to good awkward, it would seem to me in a very simplistic way that because of remote and hybrid, we suddenly have a lot more permission to be awkward, or it's easier to because of just the way we work. We could move to a work environment that is fully hybrid or fully remote and be our authentic selves because we're actually really not interacting with people the way we typically do. That opens us up to have as many awkward moments.
Yeah, it's a very interesting paradox that exists right now because, again, I agree. One would argue that in this virtual environment, we feel like we live in a fishbowl where everyone is kind of watching our every move and that we can say things and everyone sees it. And perhaps in some ways that invites more opportunity for awkward moments, awkward conversations. But in many others, it's very easy to avoid the truly awkward conversation or the truly awkward interaction. We don't have to. We can hide behind a Slack or an email or a Zoom. And so it depends, right? I think it also depends on the culture, on the context of the conversation. We can see it in both ways. What I also, I agree, I couldn't agree with you more. I think the pandemic shone a light on certain things, but frankly, A, this was building well before, and B, even let's just hope and pray one day, if somebody's listening to this 5 years down the road, this thing is way behind us. Even then, what we are continuing to see in especially working environments is this optimization for smoothness, where it's just one click, just shoot off a message. Just, nowadays we're sending important emails that are generated by a technology. Some folks are sending these off without proofreading, right? Everything is just optimized to be friction free. We don't want to worry about bumps. We don't want to worry about saying it wrong. So we're just going to make it just automated, or we're going to simplify. And I just think while there's so much beauty that comes from this emerging technology, there's also so much danger because it's stripping us of so much of our humanity. Sometimes when you have to ride the elevator with someone or you have to pick up the phone because they're not answering their DMs, something very rich comes out of that conversation. Something you didn't expect comes out of that conversation. And when we optimize for smoothness, this texture that comes from our in-person interactions is diminishing. And that's true, pandemic or not.
Yeah. There's something really interesting to me in reading the book and in relation to the idea of status. And status is always interesting to me in terms of our self-esteem, our self-talk. You have people who have not great or powerful roles, but give off this perception, whether it's in social media or beyond. You have others who have, wield tremendous power and leadership, but come off as somebody who could be compared to an entry-level person. There's a lot going on there. And yet, what's interesting about awkward is it feels like, if I zoom out, part of the challenge is we're very attached to our titles in our work. Like, what we do is who we are. Do you think there's something there in the seriousness by which we establish ourselves based off of our profession?
Mm. I think it is, we have to be careful to not look at it as a binary, right? We are either sort of this polished professional version of ourselves, or are we this, awkward, stumbly mess version of ourselves? I think different strokes for different folks without sounding overly simplistic. I know there are some, let's call it millennial Gen Z workers who really look to certain leaders that they look at as aspirational because they have it together, or they look at them as having it sorted out. And for them, those people are the ones that they admire. For others, they really prefer to look to someone who feels more relatable, feels more likable, sort of shows their edges. Enough of the research in the recent years that's come out points to the fact that even those who hold themselves in high status, high worth, and that want to give off an air of some sort of expertise, we could all stand to let our perfect guards down a little bit more. I think over the course of the last decade, that research has been pretty clear. To the extent that we're comfortable doing it, I think that's individual, right? I think if it's, and the important distinction here, similar to what we talked about with the pratfall effect, is you don't want to be so on display with all your edges that it has an effect of reducing your perception of expertise and authority. I think you have to paint this brush with a bit of discernment and judgment. It's more art than science about how often you do this.
I know in creating a book and putting it out there, you want to bang a drum and bang it loud so that people pay attention. And you make a grand statement. You say that awkward is your greatest asset. You don't even use the word potentially. It's your greatest asset. Help me believe that statement versus it being bravery is your greatest thing. Confidence is your greatest. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is there is such fascinating research around catering and performing versus being your messy, blundery, stepping in it, putting a foot in your mouth self. And so my favorite study from the whole book was one down by Francesca Gino and her team at Harvard. And there is now bodies of research that support the idea that catering to meet others' expectations, in other words, performing a version of yourself that you think other people will like, right? That is socially palatable, that you think other people will approve of, not only is exhausting and will have you collapse into bed at the end of the night, it actually has an impact on your workplace performance. It diminishes workplace performance because that effort is so high on the level of exertion. And also you're so focused on being that type of person that your creativity suffers, your innovation suffers, versus when you actually bring all of your authenticity to work. And that includes being awkward, getting it wrong, saying it, not in an eloquent way, stumbling over your words. When you do that, it actually improves workplace outcomes. So I'll give you one concrete example from her study. There was 166 entrepreneurs who were doing a pitch competition to investors. And they actually found that of these entrepreneurs, the ones that stumbled and fumbled and kind of said, hey, I don't know what to say here, I don't know if this is right, that probably felt awkward as hell in those moments, were 3 times more likely to get chosen for funding than those who were performing and catering to try to say what the investors wanted to hear. And this is something we're seeing across the board. There's other studies that now replicate this idea. And I think that, to me, is the opportunity that we have, is to bring that whole self to the workplace.
Now, with that, we've seen many instances where somebody does something bumbling, and that creates a situation where they are out in 5 seconds and shamed online and continually beaten up on.
Yes.
So can you balance this idea with the fact that we live in such contentious times? How do we balance that? Because you will see a CEO say something really stupid, put their foot in their mouth, and it becomes the thing that gets amplified, that they can't even apologize. Their apology, whether it's a day later or a week later, it's way too late. The meme is out of the bag.
Right. Twofold. First is, especially in the workplace context, we do have to test for psychological safety. I'm not suggesting that you chuck a cup of coffee on your lap and say, this is going to make me more likable, right? Test your, feet in the water a little bit as far as What have people who potentially hold higher status and power to you or perceivably to you, what can they, quote unquote, get away with? What is the level of psychological safety in the environment? Test for that first, number one. Number two is, again, to eliminate awkwardness implies eliminating uncertainty. If something like that happens, the goal, again, is to not eliminate, it's that bounce back factor. And so I think arguably when someone has slipped up like that, yes, we, send them to the pyre,
We
and we're
torture
not very
them.
kind. Of course,
Yeah.
of course. But those who recover well, right, who apologize well, who own their misstep well, rare is the day when they do it well that we don't find some level of forgiveness. Now, again, humans are going to human. Sometimes we don't. But more often than not, if they've course corrected appropriately and we feel it was genuine and human, we usually give some grace and we let them back into the club, so to speak.
But let me push back on that, because
Sure.
we live in a culture where there is a level of wokeism. We live in a cancel culture.
We do.
And I think you're right that people will ultimately be good in their apology, but damage is done. They don't get the job back. They don't get reputation back. If you Google that person 15 years later, what you see is predominantly the negative, not the actual or strong ability for them to apologize or rework it. We could even look at examples in the world of one word, Monica Lewinsky, who's done incredible work in terms of online bullying and reputation management, but nothing will overshadow what happened. There's no way that it would. And it's unfortunate because I've seen her at TED, I've seen her work. It's really an incredible story that, by the way, isn't even beholden to one person in that situation.
Right.
So how do we reconcile that in a world where cancel culture would say that we saw people, by the way, canceled that actually weren't even guilty?
Right. So two things. First, I think it goes back to, again, test your environment, know your environment, right? I think there's a degree of, if you're saying something controversial or potentially unpopular on purpose, that's very different than stepping into it by accident. So, try to have the awareness to know your environment. But also, the work, I think that from where I sit, the work is, I'm trying to engineer us out of always worrying about other people's approval. Now, again, if you are canceled entirely, I'm sorry, I'm probably not the right author to call on this book. This is probably not for you. But if you are trying things that bring a risk of misstep or a risk of blunder, and in that process, there's something that other people don't approve of, that's just part of the game, right? That is just part of risk taking. That is part of trying something. My concern is if you try things and you are so concerned with other people's reaction or approval that you are not willing to try something again. And that is what I see too often is, hey, I tried to raise my hand in this meeting. I tried to say this thing. It didn't go right. People didn't like it. They didn't approve. And that is now my new narrative. There is nothing redemptive about that situation. That is just how it went. I'm done. I'm not going to raise my hand again. I'm not going to speak up again. And that to me is so dangerous. That is so dangerous to get to that place. And so for those who are canceled, I'm sorry. People are tough. We're tough critics around here. But I hope, and maybe I'm being rosy-eyed here, I hope that most of us are not in those extreme situations and that we can recover and we can try again.
But we do live in a world of polar opposites, because the polar opposite, and I've had this conversation with multiple friends of ours who something happened in social, it got amplified or reposted by somebody super famous, and that person then got attacked. And it didn't lead to a canceling, but months and months of barrages and problems and back and forth. And my general sentiment is you're living through this and seeing it every day, when in reality, nobody else really cares or is watching you.
Right.
We live in this strange world where we're so worried about it, and we don't realize that nobody cares because they're just sitting there worried about themselves.
Right. The spotlight effect, right?
Yeah. And there was somebody who said on Twitter, in the Twitter world, somebody's going to do something that's going to create this whole thing. Let's just hope that's not you today type of, that's the general
Right.
sentiment idea. So there is this other side where we have become so self-centered that we believe that everybody is seeing this unfold and they're watching us, when in reality, all we're doing is watching ourselves.
Right. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think this is extremely pervasive and dangerous for young people, for the young population of workers who are afraid to try for fear of what you've just described. And so we need to understand, again, we cannot control other people. entirely. We can try. We will try and try until we're blue in the face, but we can't. Sometimes the thing that they don't approve of or the thing that threatens our social belonging in our minds is this tiny thing. And we're like, oh my God, everyone is screaming about this, right? We can't always predict. So the best that we can do is scan the environment, know your environment, test for psychological safety, and then try, knowing that if it doesn't go your way, that there is a gift, there is a lesson, there's a learning, and that you tried something. Can you try again? But approval, much like uncertainty, I mean, these are things that you can try for approval until you're blue in the face. It's going to exhaust you. You will collapse into bed at the end of the day, and innovation will die on the vine, creativity will die on the vine, relationships will die on the vine. There's a real consequence to that too. So pick your poison.
So what's the difference between good awkward and being daring or being willing to put it out there? Is there a difference, or ideally, or what we're saying is that these are brothers and sisters?
Yeah, I like to think of awkwardness and, courage, being daring, being bold as brother and sister in the conversation, where I like to think of good awkward as really looking for redemption in the awkward moment. So awkwardness generally, again, is in moments of uncertainty. We either plan for this, let's see how this is going to go, I'm not sure, or it's unplanned. But when there's an opportunity to take the situation that has occurred, whether planned or unplanned, and look for the gifts in the garbage, what good came from this? So I remember actually not long ago, I was in a meeting with a group and someone said something that did not go over well with the group. He said something that was, the women in the group kind of raised their hand, like, buddy, like you're not really seeing it from our perspective. It was very awkward in the room. You could feel the thickness in the air. And in that moment, you could tell he was embarrassed. You could tell he was flushed, but he said, hey, I'm pretty embarrassed. I didn't even think of it that way. And later at the break, he came to me and said, listen, that moment sucked, but I'm glad it happened. I learned something from that. I really hadn't thought of it that way. So he looked for the redemptive story, the opposite of that. And Dan McAdams from Northwestern, he calls it a contamination story. He could have gone on and on in the bathroom to himself about how he's an idiot and he stuck his foot in his mouth and he came across as a leader who didn't know what he was talking about. That was some pre-work he had done to make a choice, which is, am I telling myself a contamination story about this? Or can I look at this awkward moment and say, hey, didn't feel good, but there was some good in it. And that's the opportunity to build to that place of daring, courageous, bold, because he'll do it again next time.
So is that the immediate first step post putting your foot in your mouth or doing something like this? Walk me through what you would say to somebody. First step, second step, third step.
Sure. In an awkward moment, first step immediately, again, understanding that this is an emotion of discomfort. Humans want to get rid of this emotion of discomfort as quickly as possible. So I would say first step is in the moment, have a plan for how you'll react to a moment of awkwardness. There's a few things you can do. Number one is you can name it. Nothing will diffuse that feeling faster than speaking into the room. Woo, that was awkward, right? Or, whoa, cringe, that was embarrassing. Just naming it immediately puts everyone else at ease. And again, there's typically a someone else or an everyone else. It's a social emotion. So name it. Or you can use a touch of humor, right? You can call on your own sense of humor. I share an article or a story in the book about an IBM executive named Bob Russo, whose boss, and again, there was tested psychological safety. He would say things in a meeting that didn't land, and he would have little humorous expressions like, that went over like a fart in church, right? And it immediately brought everybody else's kind of shoulders down. They could relax, they could move forward. So have some sort of strategy, a mantra, some self-talk, something that you can say in that moment to help diffuse the situation. And then once you've had a chance to reflect with a little more space, I would do part two, which is, what was the gift in that moment? Can you find the redemptive part of that story so that it does not cause inaction the next time? Because I want that man to raise his hand the next time. I want him to be willing to put his foot in his mouth because he's inviting interesting conversation and exploration. So can you make sure to look for the redemption in that story? Don't just leave it as the contamination story, or you're going to find yourself stuck at the edge next time.
There's something that I came across in my rabbit holing of TikTok, which I tend to do. I will admit that is my current form of viewing pleasure and entertainment. And of course, none of us know how the algorithm feeds this to us, but it's a bunch of college, high school students, and the meme is covering your farts. But what's really funny about it is on purpose, they will do something like a massive cough and then the massive fart. So the joke is that they're
Right.
drawing attention to it and then letting it go versus truly trying to cover it up. That's the meme.
I
So
love it.
speaking about a fart in church, I thought this is a really interesting way to actually prep yourself for being in that really uncomfortable, like you're proactively creating this situation that couldn't be more embarrassing. These
Right.
people are going to be killers in the boardroom. That was my honest reaction
Right.
when I saw these memes was if you have the comfort to go and then lay a massive one,
Right.
you're going to be great in a boardroom.
I'm laughing because I didn't even think about this, but at home, listen, humans are going to pass gas. It's just a thing, unless again, you've got some belly things, most of us do. And at home, our kind of family thing that we do is if someone does, we're like, oh, there's a trumpet in here. Who brought that trumpet in here? Right. Or like, oh, there's a duck in this room. Right. But we immediately diffuse it and no one feels awkward. We all share a laugh. And then we've moved on. And so I think there are tactics like that for nearly every kind of run-of-the-mill situation. And then when it becomes larger, we call on our self-talk, we call on our humor, we call on our naming of it, and it helps us move through.
When we think about success, we often think about the word original. Mm-hmm. This transcends art, music, films, and it has become a part of our business vernacular. We see successful CEOs have huge levels of fame. Executives go on to do incredible things in books and celebrity status. So we live in a world where we're all shooting to be original. And I would think that in the world of good awkward, it would become, why is this a thing in a world where aren't we all shooting to be original?
Yeah, to me, I think these go hand in hand. If you are trying to be a visionary, if you're trying to be original, if you're trying to have original ideas, again, as social creatures, when you raise your hand and say something that to others feels out of left field and it lands with an awkward thud or, 20-second silence that feels like a 20-minute silence, that is going to happen. Originality means it hasn't been heard before. The social group that is being presented to is not familiar with it. That's what makes it original by nature. And sometimes when we're lucky, we may have that one other person in the room that's like, hey, there might be something to that. But often, people don't receive it the way we want it to right away. And I think it's that willingness to stay in that uncertainty longer. So I'll tell you, awkward silence is one of the most common usages of the word, but it's one that most people still struggle with. I've put this idea on the table. I'm not getting the response that I want. Stop talking. Just keep holding it until someone then chimes in. But this, as simple as that sounds, is still very difficult for people, especially for those whom their social muscles have, not been as strengthened because we're so not used to it anymore. We're not used to those silences because we don't have to endure them very much. This is where we have opportunity. This is where we can start to be more creative and more innovative is by letting ideas land. And sometimes that means a whole lot of awkward silence or a whole lot of awkward response.
Okay, Henna, so what's the one thing that made you think differently?
Okay, I'm going to sound like I'm going rogue here, but I promise I'll bring it back. I have a puppy now. She's 3 years old. I did not want a dog. My whole life, I did not want a dog. In fact, I will go so far as to say I called myself like a not dog person. Like I gave myself that identity. And a few years ago, late 2019, my daughter convinced us to get a dog. Long story short, this will surprise no one. She's my favorite thing in the entire world, right? She loves me the most. I love her the most. We are attached at the hip. And the lesson to me is identities are dangerous. Identities are dangerous. And in the context of this book, one of the things I heard over and over when I was, reaching out to beta audiences and researching and interviewing people was people kept using the term, I am so awkward. This is for me. I am so awkward. I am socially awkward. And I was just like, yeah, and I'm not a dog person, right? That stuff is so dangerous. It is subjective entirely, and it is up to us to decide what type of person we are. So yes, you might feel awkward. And yes, for a period of time, I did not particularly enjoy dogs. And yet, the minute we shake off the shackles of identity, the world opens up. So if I can become a dog person, you can stop calling yourself awkward.
I love that. The new book is called Good Awkward. Let people know where they can find out more information about the book, if you're doing other writing, podcasting, whatever you want to share.
Yeah, goodawkward.com has a lot of details about the book. It's available everywhere books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Bookshop, etc. And I am Henna Pryor on all socials, but LinkedIn is my preferred playground.
Thanks so much for your time, Henna.
Thanks, Mitch.